Okay, so I'd like to begin a series of lectures on this book by Helen Frowe called The Ethics of War and Peace, an Introduction. This is about a 2011 version of the book. It's gone through a couple of editions, and there's one I think that's been published in 2022. So this is an older version, but I've checked out. Frowe adds some a chapter here and there, and a few discussions have modified. So while I'll be holding this book up, I'm also drawing upon the latest version as well, and I'll be specific. But I've checked out the introduction, basically remains the same, and I'm going to do a little short bit on the introduction of the book. And as I always say, read the introduction because that's where an author often kind of lets you know what he or she is up to in a very general sense. And Frowe is no exception. So what does she say? Well, what's her aim in the book? Is to inform readers, basically, as it says, it's an introductory text, and it does that very nicely. Inform readers of contemporary debates in just war theory. And again, this book that I'm using here is about 10-ish years old, and the newer version is very similar. So there really is a settled kind of a set of items that would fall under the term contemporary debates in just war theory, JWT, and to encourage the readers to reflect on their own views, develop their own ideas as well. So the aim is, as a good introductory text would, it's not really out to convert anybody. It's just to let you kind of know what's going on in the field and to encourage maybe to think your way through the examples and the discussions and reflect on your own views and maybe come to some new views on your own. And she points out four features, as she says, of the scope of what she's trying to do in the book. And I think they're important because it's very different than, let's say, what Michael Walzer in Just and Unjust Wars is trying to do. Because, as he says, a moral argument with historical illustrations, Frowe is not doing that, right? She says, go ahead. She refers to a number of other books in her introduction of good historical works. She also says, like this is a classic, it's a must read, and I would agree with her on that. But that's not what she's doing here. She's not doing a history. So you're not going to read Frowe to get a history of warfare. And she's very clear. It's contemporary stuff. And it's also not using concrete examples. And I'll get to what that means in a second. So the features of the scope concentrates on the philosophical issues. Walzer is not a philosopher, claims not to be doing philosophy. Frowe is a philosopher and has written a philosopher's book on just war theory. And she said, no bones about it, concentrating on the philosophical issues that arise in war. And instead of using historical examples like Walzer does, she uses thought experiments, which philosophers often do. Not completely throughout history. It's not the only way to do philosophy, as she notes, and it's sometimes regarded as a controversial one. It's arguably very influenced by the analytic school in philosophy to use thought experiments. You find them in science now. Going back in history of philosophy and in science, some of the great originators of thought experiments were like in British empiricism, like John Locke in his discussion of personal identity uses thought experiments. So, Aristotle, I wouldn't say used thought experiments. Plato didn't really use thought experiments. A lot of contemporary continental philosophy doesn't really do thought experiments. So this is a very particular way of doing philosophy, and then bringing that to war is a very particular way of looking at the ethics of war. As Frowe says, she's not going to, look at all she said, the myriad of other ways you can approach war. That's not a book that's going to do that. So there are sociological ways and historical ways, and she said that she's not trying to do that. She probably wouldn't be able to do it, and she said it's probably ill-advised. I'm not so sure if it'd be ill-advised, but because I think it's a good idea to read all the way around these things when you're looking at something as complex as war. But nonetheless, she's very clear in saying that she's going to approach it through thought experiments. And she tries to give some kind of justification for that, admitting that it might, as she said, it might strike some readers as odd, and that history is full of real-life examples that could better serve this purpose. Again, like Walzer does. But she says something like this, and I think this is important for understanding her methodology and what she's after in this book. By using fictional examples, thought experiments, to help us identify principles that obscured by the complexities of helps to identify principles that can be obscured by the complexities of historical cases. So you can get sort of a clearer understanding of a pathway to these principles, these general rules and principles, by using thought experiments. Why? Well, because if you're looking at abstract examples, you're not going to import maybe some of your preconceived notions. If you use the historical examples, like Walzer does, as she said, many people have a particular view. If you use a country and as an example, a country's military, probably have views about that country and its military already, and that may obscure or make it more difficult to get to the general principle that's at play here. So notice, though, that the important thing is the emphasis on clarity and the idea of general rules and principles. So we're not doing a kind of casuistry by looking at historical examples and comparing them with each other and trying to see if there's general principles, but loose sort of general principles that you might have to modify in each case. No, this is a much more a particular kind of philosophical analytic approach, which thinks, we can get more of a scientific approach to ethics, and we'll see that clearly in a presupposition that she talks about, a more scientific approach to ethics than this casuistic kind of approach that Walzer takes. And that's fine. These are different ways of doing it, and they have their benefits. There's a certain benefit in clarity when you're coming up for thought experience where you can really tease out perhaps all the meanings. But again, everything comes with a price. So focus on the moral, not the legal dimension of war. So you're not going to get a lot on legalities here. That's not what Frowe's up to. As a philosopher myself, I truly am sympathetic with the line of going for the real moral issue and not always having to go through and talk about the law, because sometimes the law can be irrelevant to morality, or sometimes it's based or an extension of it. In any case, it's trying to get to the philosophical is often helpful by putting the law aside, at least for a time in the analysis, not ignoring it, but just putting it aside for the time being. But her focus is on the moral issues in just war theory. And of course, as it is contemporary, so what are philosophers currently discussing? What are philosophers arguing about today? And as I said, this copy I'm using, it's about 10-ish years old, but even if you look at the new edition of the book, it's very similar, but there's an added chapter or so. So you'll get an up-to-date picture on what's going on, and very nicely laid out as well. Again, echoing that it's informed and encouraging. So not out, which another way, it's like not out to persuade that there is one correct view on all these things. So I think the book is written with a kind of flexibility in it, where it's like, well, you could see it this way, there are problems if you do, and you could see it that way, and there are problems. And then often Frowe will kind of give what I think is probably her view, and there is a nice flexibility to it all. Where there is a fairly strong line, and again, this is not surprising given the analytic flavor of the book itself, is that some form of moral realism is true. So there are, in other words, there are right and wrong answers about issues. It's not a matter of debate. It's a matter of trying to get a conceptual clarity, and there is true and falsity. Moral propositions can be true and false. So there is, as I think, a kind of scientific approach to the ethics that's underpinning all of the discussion. So if you're not sympathetic to that, you're going to find times when Frowe and many philosophers do this. Reason demands, or morality would lead us to think, as if there is some kind of structure that is morality that's independent of us, and we're just using all these thought experiments to try and get to those principles. Whereas a person like Walzer is very skeptical of that. And so but that framework, of course, because there is a moral realism, if you assume a moral realism, that's going to have a big impact on how you interpret how just war theory works, right? And so that will come out in the course of the book, especially when you're looking at, justification for getting a war off the ground. What's that going to look like? What's it going to look like with respect to different sides, like different soldiers, right? So the soldiers on one side and the soldiers on the other. Can you have a moral equivalency there? Right? That's going to come into question because there is a real correct answer, a real right thing and a wrong thing going on in the background. So it's a very interesting and thoughtful approach. But again, keep in mind, like with what Walter as well, it is an approach, and it's one way to start looking at war. But it's definitely an interesting one as well. So on the next video, I will start digging into this text. See you then.